All right, here we go. We're going to talk about the first question here is which pair does not belong together? Okay, which pair does not belong together? So this is a word correlation, if you want to sort of speak. So three answers, they do belong together, and one answer, they're if you want to look at it, they're kind of opposite. Okay. So escheat, testate, fee simple, absolute. That looks pretty good, close together. So the ones that don't meet the definition and belong together is escheat and testate. Why? Because testate, someone dies without a will, right? Or excuse me, escheat, someone dies without a will. They die intestate. Intestate, they do have a will. So those are opposites. Fee simple, absolute, same. Special assessments, superior liens, same. Judgment liens, junior liens are the same. Okay. All right. So this kind of falls under a couple of different headings, right? You got different terminologies, four answers, different terminologies that deal in answers that aren't alike. And so the first one, when we talked about intestate, testate, and then escheat. So they had escheat and testate. Okay. These are title transfers. So one is with a will, the other one's without a will. And then under ownership, we talk about freehold estate. So fee simple and then absolute have the same meaning. Highest and best form of ownership recognized by law. And then the lien priorities, right? Tax liens, special assessments are superior. And then under D2, junior liens are based on date recorded. Okay. All right. Economic characteristics of real estate include. Which one do you think that is? Remember, watch this. Economic deals with what? Money. So how does money affect, or what is the money characteristics of real estate? What do you think it is? What do you think affects the economics or the money value of real estate? All right, so let's look at this real quick. When we talk about physical components, let me back up. When we talk about physical components, in other words, physical characteristics, durability, uniqueness, not one piece of property is the same, and the fact that it's immobile, you can't move it, okay? But situs is a term we use to describe an economic characteristics. Why? Because the term situs is another word for location, location, location. So if I take a 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch style home, put it somewhere on the panhandle in Florida, I'll make these up, just making these numbers up, maybe worth $175,000. If I take that exact same house and put it down in Sarasota on the beach, what's going to happen to the money value of it? It's going to go up, right? Probably in the neighborhood of $500,000-$600,000 now. Same house, only because of its location. So always remember situs, which means location, location, location. Any one different location can bring a different economic meaning to it. Okay, homes in the Panhandle are worth one price. Homes along the beachfronts are worth a tremendous higher price. You'll see this within your community when you're dealing with real estate. Okay, when you're dealing with real estate in your community, even as small of a county or a city that you're at, right, as small as it is, you're still going to have, watch this, areas that are affected economically due to the location. Okay, could be the center of the community versus a beachfront, right? So the value as you get close to the water goes up. So we're talking about area situs, which is location, location, location. All right, which disclosure document is required for the sale of condominiums from a developer of more than 20 residential units? Out of these answers, you don't see prospectus, but there's one that is prospectus and another one that are going to be required for the sale of a condominium from a developer. That's a new sale of more than 20 units. Which one do you think it is?
Ready to pass the Florida Sales Associate, Broker, Mutual Recognition, or Endorsement State exam on your first try? Get our exam prep database that contains practice exams tied to over 1,000 exam-style questions with detailed explanations. Enjoy 3 months of 24/7 access from any device, including desktop, laptop, tablet, and mobile. Click here and use the coupon code YouTube to get a special discount.
Okay, let's take a look at this. Condominium ownership. Remember, you own fee simple under A, 1, 2, 3, and 4. It talks about the ownership. You own the cube in the sky. It is undivided interest. Okay. And then in the common areas, in other words, everybody has a usage and divides up the common areas by use. Use only, not ownership. You only own the cube in the sky. Declaration and bylaws is what creates, the declarations is what creates the condominium. Bylaws are the rules and regulation. Now, if you look under 6A, new condominiums, okay, 15 calendar days, here it is right here. Prospectus and estimated operating budget are required for disclosure. Those are the two. Okay, the answer we had to select from, because there was no prospectus, is estimated operating budget. So they're going to have either one, or they may have both in the same answer. Okay, and it's a 15 calendar day. Okay, so we're talking about prospectus, estimated operating budget. And then for a resale, it's 3 business days. Okay, again, declaration, articles of incorporation, bylaws, and then frequently asked questions are going to be the makeup of disclosure documents, right? 3 business days for a resale, 15 calendar days for a new condominium sale over 20 units. Here's the condominium picture I wanted to give you. Remember, you own the cube in the sky. Down there at the right picture and the left, you see the swimming pool. All that's going to be shared common areas. Okay. All right, let's move on. Land value is obtained separately when using which approach to estimating value? Land value. Land value obtained separately when using which approach? Remember, we're talking about the appraisal method here. We've got the sales comparison approach, we got the cost approach, and then the income approach, okay? What is it called when the land has got to be separated, right? Separated, value the building, and then add the land back in. Which one would that be? Income approach, market cost, or multiplier approach? Okay, let's take a look at this. Remember, separately, land is separated. In the cost approach, watch this. This is a very important concept that you understand what a cost approach. Everybody look up here at the camera. The cost approach is for special purpose buildings, a post office, a church, a library, any type of government building, okay? Anything where you can't compare any sales data. There is no post office that's going to be like the one that's being sold. There is no church or library that has multiple sales that can compare with, okay? There is no income that's produced from a church and or a post office or a library that can generate a valuation based on income produced, okay? So the only way, watch this, the only way they can value is to see how much it costs to rebuild it, brand new, okay? So they get the actual dimensions of the post office, library, government building, and they'll get an appraiser to give a cost on how much it would build exactly the same, only the building. So the land, watch this, has to be separated, and you get the cost of the building only, okay? And then you add the land back into it, okay? So when you see a question that talks about land separated, for the fact of valuing property, we're talking about the cost approach, okay? Remember, we don't have anything to compare with. We don't have any income that's generated to be able to give a valuation. So they have to go with a cost approach method. So the appraiser is going to use a price per square foot. What's it going to cost to rebuild this? And then they get the value of the land and they add it back in. So we're talking about C, cost approach. Here's a nice picture I put up for y'all. If you want to take a picture of this, you can. So the bottom right picture, there's your post office. Okay, so they're going to do a replacement cost on that building, brand new, and then they'll depreciate it. And on the top left, the land that it sits on, and again, I had to make this up, so work with me here. The land is going to be separated. So if it gives you a problem where the property's $300,000, they say the land is only worth 30% of the value of the property or what it sold for, you got to take 30% of 300,000 and pull that out as land. And then you take that remaining balance, right? And that's the cost approach that you're going to work from, okay? Once you get that, you add it all back in together, okay? It's called the cost approach. All right, which action would likely result in a charge of conversion? Which of the following would be a charge in conversion or of conversion? Answer C, the broker is going to place escrow funds in the operating account to use. So if you look at number 3 and 4, what you have to really understand between these two words is commingling is just mixing personal funds with escrow money. Conversion is actually using that money for operating expenses, okay? A couple other things you want to know about managing escrow accounts. Remember, non-bearing interest is typically for real estate transaction, although written authorization from the buyer and seller to have an interest-bearing account for a transaction must be approved, but you can have a bearing interest account. And then for Florida, the maximum for a sales escrow account that a broker can keep is $1,000 of personal money. That's not considered commingling. Be careful with that because you may get a question that says the broker has $950 or opening an account and putting in $950 of their own money into the escrow account. That is allowed. That's not commingling. Remember, the broker is allowed to keep up to $1,000. That's it, not $1,001. That would be commingling of personal funds. Property management, $5,000. Okay. So that would be a rental and sales escrow account. So property management, $5,000. And if they're going to use one account for both, they can go to $5,000. Okay. Record keeping is for 5 years. Also make sure you know that title companies, if they do hold escrow money on the contract, you got to have the name, address, and telephone number of the attorney or title company holding the escrow on the agreement. Okay. So everybody knows and agrees who's holding it. Okay. Over which factor of depreciation does a property owner have the least control? So we're going to look at some terms here about depreciation. And so we're talking about the least control. In other words, let's say you live in a house and that term depreciation has to think of it as depreciation kind of goes with the word maintenance, keeping the house up. So what do you have control of? And then this question says, what don't you have? Or what's the least factor out of these answers that you don't have control of? So we're talking about forces outside the property, right? So let's look at a couple terms here. Depreciation. This is how much of an asset's value has been used up. So we got 3 types that we see in our content. One's called physical deterioration. The other one's functional obsolescence and external obsolescence. So physical deterioration is nothing more than wear and tear. Okay. Again, the property owner has control over that depreciation, a term there, physical deterioration. So modern upgrades, improve the landscape, basically is cost maintenance. Okay. Every year. Functional obsolescence. This is poor and eccentric in design, like a 4-bedroom, 1 bath. Imagine having 8 people in a house. Parents, and then 2 in each room, children. So you got 8 people sharing 1 bathroom. What a nightmare that would be, right? Is it out of code? No. You can have a 4-bedroom, 1 bath. There's nothing in the code that says you can't. Does the family fit the house? Yeah, it fits the house, but it's going to be very tough. So that term functional, hence the word function, obsolescence or obsolete, very eccentric in design. So the cure to that would be a cost input or a contribution input to make it to where it is functional. right? That would be a curable effect on depreciation by adding a bathroom, now making it a 4.2. Okay. And so answer C or answer D fits letter C, external, outside the survey. You don't have any control over that, right? Somebody builds a golf course, you're going to get value added. Somebody puts a waste management site, dump site next to, shopping mall, restaurant. You don't have any control over that, but it will determine value. Okay. And in the local planning agency, if you look in the gold box, governing body, they do site plan approval. So the local governing body deals with traffic, parking, surrounding how it affects the properties, surrounding properties affected. Okay. Under the master plan, how is the community going to flow, et cetera, right? So we're looking at forces outside the property boundary that the owner doesn't have control over.
For more practice questions, videos, and insight into the state exam, we encourage you to join our free exam prep webinar, How to Pass the Real Estate Exam Without Your Real Estate Book and with only 15 to 20 hours of study time. Click here to get registered.
All right. A type of concurrent ownership that provides an undivided interest in the property with no right of survivorship. A type of concurrent ownership. So first of all, you got to define what concurrent ownership means. And that's two or more. That's co-ownership, right? So you could say a type of co-ownership that provides undivided interest in the property. Undivided. Watch this. And here's the other key word you want to look for. No right of survivorship. Okay. Remember, no right of survivorship. Well, estate and severalty means, remember, to be severed means independent. You're the sole owner. Inseveralty means to be severed from everybody. So you own the property yourself. Concurrent ownership is two or more. Okay, so those two terms, what they're asking for is a two or more ownership. So A doesn't fit that definition because it's severed or individual. Okay. The right of survivorship comes under joint tenancy. So the one with no right of survivorship would be tenancy in common. So let's look at this real quick. These are the two big ones you want to know for the state or the licensing exam when it comes to concurrent ownership or co-ownership, two or more. You've got tenancy in common and joint tenancy. Tenancy in common gives the most protection to the families. Okay, what do I mean by that? Watch this. You own your portion in severalty. In other words, let's say you and I bought an investment property and you owned or you put up 70% of the money and I came in with 30%. Okay. So you've got 70% investment. You're vested 70% and I'm vested 30%. We are a co-ownership or a concurrent ownership under tenancy in common, but you own your 70 and I own my 30 in severalty. In other words, I can do whatever with my portion, what I want to do with. I can leave a will to my children for my 30%. If I want to sell my portion, I can. I don't need your permission, in other words. And whatever I do with my portion, you don't have any rights to it. Hence the word right of survivorship. So there is no right of survivorship. This is the best co-ownership that protects the families, each individual family. Because you can write a will. You can even, bring your family members in on your vested portion. So it doesn't interrupt yours and I's co-ownership agreement because you own your 70 in severalty or by yourself and I own my 30. So I can do whatever I want. So that gives you the best protection. What gives you the least protection is called joint tenancy. Now we can't own undivided interest. It's got to be divided. So for you and I, it'd be 50-50 on this investment if we formed it under a joint tenant or joint tenancy. We would each joint tenant have the right of ownership of 50-50 under 2A1. The interest would be equal, 50-50. We would be at the same time at the title company signing the paperwork, and we would both be on the deed as 50-50 owners under, watch this, the habendum clause of to have and to hold joint tenancy. Okay, you and I would be 50-50. Now, if I pass or I die, you receive 100%. It doesn't go to my family. I can't do now what I could in tenancy in common because of the right of survivorship. So now you do have a vested interest in my share when I pass. Okay, you get it. You become the sole owner. And so creating the 4 unities, which gives the least protection to the family. So I can't leave a will because the property would go to you. Okay. All right. A property owner who does not reside on the property and who often relies on a professional property management company to manage the investment is known as what? Who is this person called? Right? Owns the property, doesn't live on the property, and has to rely on a property management company. What are they called? Okay, let's go ahead and go into this. All right, this is under the property management section out of chapter 1, right? So if you look in the blue box, property management, this is a manage for the property for the owners. Okay, so as a property manager, you're going to represent the owner in all their efforts in what you're going to do. Okay, if you're a rental agent, all you're going to do is list property or find a tenant, and that's it. You're not going to manage the property. They're called rental agents. Now, under AC, that's what you want to know. What is an absentee owner? They don't live in the property, but they rely on you for property management. They're called absentee owners. And let me tell you, Florida has many, many. If you start in Pensacola, wrap around towards Sarasota, come up the eastern seaboard, Daytona, it's lined with beach homes and condos. And how many people you think live there full time? Okay, besides the retirement community, maybe very few, right? So it's predominantly absentee owners for investments, right? They rent it out, okay? So when it comes to what the individual's called that doesn't live in the property, that's first key, but needs someone to manage it, they're called absentee owners, okay? And then the compensation is typically, it's a base plus percentage off the effective gross income. You won't be tested. This is just kind of some other property management things. Got to be licensed. You may see that on a test. To get paid a commission. You can work for a property management company if you're paid salary and not licensed. Okay. And as a sales or a broker associate, you can't work independently as a property manager. Okay. But you got to be under a sponsoring broker to do that. Okay. All right, the owner of an office building has signed an exclusive listing agreement with the broker. The listing agreement contains information about the broker's lien rights in accordance with Part 3 of the 475 Florida statute. If the owner sells the property without paying the broker commission, what can the broker do? This is kind of a weird question, so I'm just going to kind of go into the explanation. Let me just go ahead and go into it. Look, under bullet 1 and bullet 2, let's start with bullet 1. Under the Florida 475 statutes, part 1. Remember, part 1 is licensing law. That's us. Part 2 is the appraisers. Part 3 is sales for commercial. Okay, we're talking about commercial sales, non-residential commercial sales. What happens if a commission is not paid? And then part 4 is a commercial lease. What does the broker's rights have if the commission is not paid on the lease? Okay. So if you go back and look at the question, it talks about if the owner sells the property without paying the broker commission, what can the broker do? And the answer is B, place a lien against the seller's net proceeds of the sale. Okay. So if you look at A, bullet 1, we're talking about sales. That's the Florida statute licensing law, okay, that a broker can do on a commercial sale, not a lease. Part 3 deals with sales. So if they sells a commercial building, they're not paid a commission, then what happens is the lien is for non-payment the lien, and it's attached to the net proceeds. In other words, it's going to be held back by the closing attorney, okay, for the sale of commercial property. You cannot, listen to this, you cannot file a lien against their real property, okay, which means the home they sell in or live in, okay? Remember, in order to file a lien by law, you got to have a contract. In the contract, you got to state the purpose of non-payment, that a lien is what's going to take place, okay? Now, if you got a listing agreement for a commercial building and the sale is not paid for on the commercial building, you surely can't file a lien on their personal property or their real property, their home, in other words, okay? And you can't put a lien on the building that was sold because it's under a new owner, okay? So that's not legal to do that because the agreement for non-payment doesn't come from the new owner, okay? It's coming from the seller. So what can they do? They can file a lien and it's attached to the net proceeds, or what the attorney is going to pay out can hold back. They can hold back that money as far as the net proceeds before any money is collected by the seller. And before any money is collected, that lien will suffice in paying off the commission before the seller can collect any money. Now, under 475 Part 4 is a little different story because the seller still owns the building, okay? So the lien rights for the broker of non-payment for a lease, if the broker or if the building owner doesn't pay, then the lien is attached to the owner's commercial property. Now, because they still own it, you can now put a lien against the property, okay? Now, if the tenant who's applying doesn't pay and they are supposed to pay, then it attaches to the leasehold estate. Okay, the actual leasehold. Okay. Remember, as a sales or associate broker, you cannot file liens, only your broker. Okay. So if you have issues, if you ever get in commercial and you have issues when it comes to sales or leases and getting paid, you take it to your broker. Your broker must file. Because remember, the listing agreement is with the broker, okay, not the sales associate. So you can't do any lien action, only the broker can. So you want to know, and just know it in its basic sense, just like we saw here in the question, Part 3 of 475, first thing should go off. That's commercial sales, lien rights for a broker, okay? And you look at the answers. May record a lien on the office building. Nope, can't do that. May place a lien against the seller's net proceeds from the sale. I can do that. Can I record a lien with an effective date of the listing agreement? No. Can I record any lien without first obtaining a court judgment? No. Okay. So the one that makes sense in this is putting against their proceeds. Okay. All right. The southwest 1/4 of the southeast 1/4 of the northwest 1/4 of section 10, township 3 south, range 5 east, describes a tract of how many acres? How many acres are we looking at here? How many acres are we looking at? All right, let's go through this. Now, we talked about in the government rectangular system, in your studies, you got the principal meridian, the north-south line, and the east-west is the baseline. You've got range lines and tier lines. They're 6 miles apart, separated north and south, east and west, and they form a 6x6, which is 36 square miles, okay? Now, that's called a township. And then a section is a little 1 by 1, 1 mile by 1 mile, and you get 36 of them in a township. And each section is equal to 640 acres. And then 1 acre, if you trim it down, equals 43,560 square feet. Now, watch this. Let's work out a problem. And this is kind of a map of a picture of you can see that this is section 1, 6, all the way to 36. Remember, these are little 1 by 1s. This is your township. Here's your 6 by 6. Okay. Always remember, if you see this on the state exam, section 16, if they just ask you a straight trivia question or true and false, is always reserved for the school. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and look at this. How do we work this out? Well, we're going to start in section 10 because we know that's 640 acres. So township 3 south, range 5, 8, just get rid of all that. To mathematically work this out and determine how many acres, you start with section 10. And you're going to work it in reverse, okay? So if I take section 10, that's 640 acres. Under number 2, or excuse me, section 10, under number 3, I'm going to take 640 acres and divide it by my first northwest 1/4, or divide it by 4, okay? That gives me 160 acres. So what I'm saying is the northwest 1/4 of section 10, that's 160 acres, okay? Now, if I go to the southeast, I'm going to go one more to the left. The southeast of the northwest, then that's 160 acres. Again, divided by 4, the denominator, I get 40 acres. So what I'm saying, the southeast 1/4, I'm saying it's 40 acres of the northwest 1/4, which is 160 acres of section 10, which is 640 acres. And then I'm going to go to the last one. And I'm going to take 160 acres, or that's 40 acres. And I'm going to take 40 acres, and I'm going to divide it by 4, another denominator, and I get 10 acres. So the answer to the question is 10 acres. Now, you see the southwest 1/4, southeast 1/4. It could be 1/2. Whatever number the denominator is, just divide it by that number. Take that answer, go to the next one, and just work it reverse till you get to the last one, and that's going to be the acreage. Okay? Okay. A licensee has been asked to determine the current market value of a 6-year-old building with a reproduction cost of $480,000. When new, the economic life of the structure was estimated to be 40 years. The site value, or the land value, is known to be $100,000. What's the current market value of the entire property? All right, so let's take a look at this. All right. In theory, this is used by appraisers, again, for special purpose buildings. You've got a building, and then you got the site improvement, right? You got the land. They already separated it for you, okay? Again, post office, churches, government buildings. This is the type of building that an appraiser will use. An appraisal method will use to appraise these type of buildings. Now, the step method that the appraiser does is they're going to estimate the reproduction cost, which is the square footage times a price per square foot to build it. That's how much it's going to cost to build the building. Then they're going to subtract the accrued depreciation, estimate the land value, which they give you in the problem, and then add it back in. Okay, so let's work this out. So the problem is in orange, right? License B been asked to determine the current market value. 6-year-old building. It's got a reproduction cost of $480,000. They give you that. They give you the economic life of 40 years. And they tell you the land value is $100,000. So let's break this down. Look on the left side where I've got formula, A, B, C, and D. I'm going to take my reproduction costs. Remember what it's going to cost to build it. I'm going to subtract my accrued depreciation. That's going to give me C, the depreciated value. And then I'm going to add my land back in, which is D. And I list this out on the left. And then on the right-hand side, I'm doing this all on my scratch paper. On the right-hand side, I'm going to unpack my numbers. So what's my reproduction price? $480,000. Now I got to calculate what my accrued depreciation is. And the way you do the straight line method for accrued depreciation is I'm going to take $480,000, and they give me the life expectancy, useful life expectancy of 40 years. If I divide that out, that's $12,000 per year, right? The building is 6 years old. So it's a total of $72,000 over 6 years. It has depreciated. Okay. I'm going to subtract that. I get $408,000. I add back in my land, and I get $508,000 for the answer. Okay. Very easy. Just take your reproduction costs. They give it to you. You got to calculate your accrued depreciation, but they give you 40 years. So I'll take 480,000 divide by 40. I get $12,000 per year. Well, the building's 6 years old, so it's depreciated only $72,000 up through 6 years. Well, if I subtract that from my reproduction costs, I get 408, and then I'm going to add the land back in. Okay, so an appraiser would appraise this at 508,000.
Ready to pass the Florida Sales Associate, Broker, Mutual Recognition, or Endorsement State exam on your first try? Get our exam prep database that contains practice exams tied to over 1,000 exam-style questions with detailed explanations. Enjoy 3 months of 24/7 access from any device, including desktop, laptop, tablet, and mobile. Click here and use the coupon code YouTube to get a special discount.
All right, which statement regarding a due on sale clause is not true? Remember, you have to define what a due on sale clause is. That means if the home's sold, the note's got to be paid, right? Due on sale. So which statement is not true? So let's go over this real quick. All right, mortgage provision. This falls under the mortgage provision. And this is all the clauses that we see within the promissory note for the mortgage itself. Prepayment clause, acceleration clause, right to reinstate, due on sale clause, and then a defeasance clause. So the one we're looking at is a due on sales clause, number 4. Okay. So a due on sale clause means don't pay the debt service, lender call the note due plus interest, penalty and interest. Cannot assume a loan with a clause in the note. Property sells, watch this under 4C, if the property sells, then must pay the loan in full. So basically what happens is this forbids property being transferred to another owner without the note being paid. So a due on sale, hence the word due on sale. The clause says if you transfer the property or sell the property, you got to pay the note off. Okay. And that's what it's talking about. And the answer is D. The clause releases the mortgagor, that's the owner, from personal liability on the sale of the property. Okay. Due on sale. All right. Which reason would not make a valid contract to purchase and sell real estate unenforceable? Which reason would not make a valid contract to purchase and sell real estate unenforceable? Which reason would not make a valid contract to purchase or sell unenforceable? Okay. Kind of a tongue tire there, right? Well, first you got to go over and review what makes a valid contract. So let's look at this. Remember the acronym I gave y'all before, COLC, C-O-L-C. You've got to have contractual capacity of the parties, legal age, sound mind. You've got to have offered acceptance, which is a meeting of the minds, which is mutual assent or consent, offered acceptance, signatures. You got to have a legal description of what you're signing for, okay? Not a mailing address. That's informal. This is a formal description, legal description like we talked about, government rectangular, meets and bounds, the lot and block type legal description. It's got to be a legal contract. And then the consideration, which is the price for the property, in our case, in the real estate, is the price of the home, okay? Now, when it comes to the term void, voidable, and unenforceable. So let's go back to the question real quick. Talking about which reason would not make a valid contract to purchase and sell real estate unenforceable. So let's go back and look at what unenforceable means. Okay, so unenforceable means it cannot be enforced in a court of law. Okay, in other words, the contract may have exceeded its term limits. Okay, there may have been duress for signatures and not a free act and will of acknowledgement. If the property is destroyed, okay, through a hurricane destruction, okay, again, all these constitutes unenforceable. Which one doesn't out of these four is the answer D. In other words, if I don't take any earnest money as pledge deposit, that does not make it unenforceable. Okay. Earnest money is not a deciding factor to make the contract unenforceable. Okay. In other words, the contract can still be enforced in a court of law. Okay. So no earnest money was pledged would be the answer. Okay. Answer D. All right. The maximum Save Our Home benefit that may be transferred to a new homestead. Okay. This is under our Save Our Home benefits that may be transferred. In other words, you're moving from one property to another. There can be up to a maximum amount of exemption, homestead exemption, that can be transferred in your new move. Okay. So let's look at the Save Our Home. This limits the increase in value from 1 year to the next, okay, and transferring to another new home if you sell and buy a new home. Now, the increased value is calculated on the lesser of the two. So the appraisers cannot increase the property tax above the 3% under 1A, 3% annually from the previous assessed year. So they can't go above 3% of the previous year. Or, and it's going to be of a lesser, or a percent change in the consumer price index from the preceding year. Okay. So again, we're talking about the consumer price index, that's our inflation, and or the previous year's assessed value. 3%, okay, is the maximum that it can increase. Now, when transferring property under A2, when going to a new homestead that's bought, the new homestead owner can transfer. This is called portability or to port up to $500,000. Okay. Now remember, the Save Our Home is an additional benefit that's subtracted from the assessed value to give a new assessed value in which the homestead is applied. Okay. So the maximum that can be ported or transferred would be $500,000. So the example I give you in below, if you look at the smaller house, and let's say they wanted to upsize, go to a bigger home, the home on the right. Let's say the current market, these are made up numbers, so don't panic on where I got them. They're made up. Say the market value is $300,000, and the Save Our Home benefit is $150,000. Okay, that's what it comes out to. Remember, the maximum is $500,000, and the assessed value is $150,000. Now, if you upsize, again, the Save Our Home benefit equals $100,000. If the new market value is $500,000, then the assessed value, again, will start at $350,000. Okay. This is before the exemptions apply. Okay. So anytime somebody's moving up, scaling up, or it could be scaling down too, but anytime you transfer them to new property, the maximum benefit that each owner can get is up to $500,000 under the Save Our Home benefit. Okay. All right, if a buyer and seller claim the earnest money deposit in the broker's escrow account, how much time does the broker have to notify the FREC or the real estate commission in writing? Okay, let's go ahead and just break this down real quick. This falls under the notice and settlement procedure under 475. What happens when there's a dispute? And what is the resolution process between brokers? Okay. Remember, the brokers are going to assume responsibility of the escrow account, and that's where the transaction funds are kept. The deposit belongs to the depositor or the buyer. Okay. It's just held by the listing broker in the escrow account. Okay. Again, the broker must not deliver the deposit to the other party until the transaction closed or it's been agreed upon. Okay. Now, in conflicting demands, buyer and seller disagree, and there has to be a resolution on who's getting a deposit, maybe a split, but that's going to be determined under 475. And here's how it goes. So buyer and seller make a demand regarding disbursement of the escrow property. It's inconsistent. It can't be resolved. All right. So under 1A, we have conflicting demands. Watch this. Make note of this. 1A is 15 business days. The broker must notify FREC of the conflicting demands. In other words, which ones they're going to use. Then under 1B, 30 business days, they have to execute one of the 4 settlement procedures, okay, which is, again, according to law. So they have to notify FREC of the conflicting demands, that there's and one exists, there's a conflict that exists. They get 15 business days. I said, well, John, what do they do up, what are they doing for 15 business days? Maybe trying to resolve it between each other, right? Maybe trying broker and both parties getting together trying to mediate, right? Or do something of that nature. But if they can't, and they're just really struggling with this, then there's up to a 15-day business days that the broker's got to notify the Florida Real Estate Commission that there is a conflict. Then 30 business days, they can execute one of the 4 settlement procedures. Under your licensing law, we use the acronym MALE, M-A-L-E. Can mediate, arbitrate, litigate, or they can do an EDO or an escrow disbursement order. Okay? And so mediation, again, that's just mediating between parties. Arbitration is like a court, but it's not. But the decision will be made by an arbitrator. So there is no resolving or mediating. Once it gets to arbitration, then a decision will be made. Or they can litigate. Okay? Now, if the broker does an EDO, they're going to send this to the Florida Real Estate Commission, and they'll make a decision. Okay? So you want to know 15 business days to notify FREC of a conflict when it comes to deposits, 30 business days to execute one of the 4, which is MALE, mediation, arbitration, litigation, and EDO. Okay? All right. Let's go ahead and press on to our next question. Which characteristic is a disadvantage of real estate investment? A lot of these are common sense, okay? When it comes to the disadvantage, you have to understand what the term leverage or borrowed funds means. And is that an advantage or disadvantage? You got to understand how the degree of risk involves real estate. Is that an advantage or disadvantage? And then the return on investment. Again, is that an advantage or disadvantage? And then how is tax treatment towards real estate? Does that fall under an advantage or a disadvantage? Okay. So when we talk about disadvantages, let's move into some discussion here. So these are disadvantages. Okay. I'm just going to go over and highlight the ones here in bold. Illiquidity, market is local in nature. Okay. Need for expert help, management, and risk. Okay. Now, when we talk about illiquid or illiquidity, okay, that means real estate is illiquid because money is not readily available. Say, well, John, my house is paid off. Okay. Are you employed? No, I don't have a job. Well, do you think you're going to refinance your home and qualify for it? Don't have any way to pay the loan. So there's no way to get to your money on your home. Okay. That's illiquid. All right. So real estate, although it's a depreciable asset, it grows in value. It brings a good return on investment. All these things about advantages. One of the disadvantages, you can't get to the cash quickly, like going to the bank into the savings account or writing a check or cashing in a stock, etc. Okay. So illiquidity is a real disadvantage. The fact that it's local in nature consolidates everything to an economy, what type of job availability, government restrictions, and hey, what's the social trends in those areas? Okay, so that can be a disadvantage as well. You know, if you're located, you buy an investment property up by Jacksonville, Florida, where the Naval Air Station is, you know, what happens if that Navy base gets shut down? There goes all your rental income, right? Because usually you get a lot of Navy personnel that may rent from you. Right. So availability of jobs based on the economy. Okay. So market location being so local and concentrated can actually be a disadvantage. Need for expert help. This is us, brokers and sales associates. Right. So individuals need help on how to invest. Right. Very big disadvantage. And in property management, remember we talked about absentee owners. Again, it's going to cost money for the owner or the absentee owner to have someone, especially if they're out of town. Chicago or New York or whatever the case may be. Okay. The answer to our question is risk. Okay. So it's the degree of risk. If I go back and look at the question, which characteristic is a disadvantage? Leverage or borrowed funds is an advantage, right? What does that mean? I'm not using my $150,000 to buy the property. I'm using the banks, right? So leverage money is an advantage for an investment. The degree of risk always involved in anything you do, some higher, some lower, but real estate does have a degree of risk involved. Okay, again, buying close to a naval air station, relying on that one source of economy. Well, if that base shuts down, you can see the risk involved. Return on investment is an advantage, right? And then tax treatment. You can depreciate your property and actually get tax credits to keep more money in your property. Okay, so that's an advantage. So we're talking about degree of risk. Remember, investment property will decrease in value or not generate enough income to make it profitable for the investor. Okay. All right, next question. The estate in real property with the least bundle of rights. How you like this? We go from an investment disadvantage to now we're in the bundle of rights ownership. All right, so the estate in real property with the least bundle of rights. Least bundle of rights. Remember, for example, if you look at fee simple, right? We saw fee simple and absolute in our first question as being two that mean the same. And it's the highest we saw in our studies. It's the highest recognized by law. What? Ownership, right? So that wouldn't be one, right? Tenancy at sufferance. And tenancy at will and estate for years is all leasehold or rental. So that's actually, those three are going to fall in the category of leased to fee simple. So we know fee simple is not, it's got to be between B, C, and D. So you got to pick the least one out of B, C, and D, and they're all defined. Okay. An estate for years is a stop time. Okay. So 6-month lease, 1 week lease, whatever it may be. At will, still paying, but it's at will. There's no time set. At sufferance means they're holding over. They're not paying rent. So eviction time comes, right? So that would be, right, the least of the rights in an ownership of property when it comes to fee simple or leasehold. Okay. So leasehold, for sure, the least bundle of rights would be at sufferance, meaning you don't have any rights if you're there and you haven't paid your month's rent or your next month's rent. Now, leasehold estate, this is a non-freehold. Again, the tenant only has equitable possession, not legal title. So we saw that fee simple absolute is the highest and best. So that wouldn't fall under the least. Okay. And so when we talk about leasehold estates, again, estate for years, tenancy at will, notice B3. This is holding over, not paying for rent. Basically, it's called naked possession of non-payment of rent. This has the least of the tenancies. There is no leasehold. There is no right for that tenant they're holding over. Okay, so that's going to be the least. The highest and best, if they ask that, would be fee simple, right? All right, next question. Which closing cost may not be paid by the veteran borrower on a new VA mortgage loan? In other words, a VA borrower can't pay this fund, only paid by the seller. Okay. What do you think it is? We know that the VA funding fee is an administrative fee that the buyer's got to pay. Okay, that's the borrower. The VA appraisal, that falls on the borrower too. That's the buyer. So A and B doesn't fit this definition. It's got to be between C and D. And who usually picks up the recording fees? Right? And land records, not the seller, the buyer does, right?
For more practice questions, videos, and insight into the state exam, We encourage you to join our free exam prep webinar, How to Pass the Real Estate Exam Without Your Real Estate Book and with only 15 to 20 hours of study time. Click here to get registered.
So the buyer can pay those three. The one they can't pay for is a termite inspection fee. So you just got to know that for the state exam, okay? So we're looking under B11, under the VA mortgage loan. So if you look at B11, it says termite inspections. This is pest inspection is the only cost the VA requires that the seller pay for, okay? Looking at some other characteristics of a VA mortgage loan, got to be honorably discharged veteran or active duty armed forces. Okay. You got to show a certificate of eligibility under 2. That's what it's called, certificate of eligibility. Properties or single family, co-ops, condos. Okay. Discount points can be used and paid for. Okay. Now, the loan guarantee is partial payment. The actual government guarantees up to 25% of the loan amount. Okay. In other words, if it forecloses, the government will give the lender 25% of what that payoff is, or the home loan, and then they'll put it on the market and sell it real quickly at 75% below market value, right? And that house will go quickly. But the actual mortgage company retains and puts it on the market as a foreclosed property. Unlike FHA, they'll pay the whole house off, and the government gets it back as a HUD home because it's insured. Recording fees, debit to the buyer under 8, VA funding fee, appraisal, all paid for by the buyer. 0 down payment for VA loans, and interest rate set by the lender. Remember, government loans aren't allowed prepayment penalties or prepayment clauses. So remember that for the state exam. FHA and VA won't allow it. Okay. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 made discrimination illegal if based on any of the criteria except, what do you think that answer is? The Civil Rights Act of 1968 made discrimination illegal if based on any of these areas except, what do you think that is? (1968) made it illegal based on which of the following? Remember, when we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 68, we're talking about, watch this, residential fair housing, okay? Remember the fresh corn memory aid I put up for y'all. The one that doesn't fit this is C, age. What does age belong to? That belongs to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or the lender's discrimination. So sex, race, and religion, A, B, and D, follow the protected classes for fair housing, residential, under the Civil Rights Act of 68. Okay. The one that doesn't is going to be age. That falls under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or the lender's side of discrimination. Okay. So take a picture of this, because I drew this up for y'all, and it's like hanging a curtain rod. It's called fresh corn. So I'm hanging a curtain rod right here, fresh corn. And then I'm going to hang my drapes. F stands for familia status. R stands for race. Nothing for E, sex or gender. H, handicap. C, color. Nothing for O. Religion, R. And national origin for N. Okay? So the one that doesn't fit this is going to be age. And that falls under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Be careful with this question. Let me go back and show you. Be careful with this question when it comes except, because a lot of times you'll say the Civil Rights Act of 68, discrimination, and you don't read the rest of it. And so you got to read and unpack these questions. What are they asking? They're asking for discrimination except. Okay, so fair housing, fresh corn. One in here doesn't fit the fresh corn, and the one is age. Okay, so that's how you would answer that. All right, the most important objectives of the Federal Truth in Lending Act are to ensure disclosure of financial charges and what? Remember, Truth in Lending Act is a federal act, federal regulation. The short term we see in our everyday life, we usually call that TILA, T-I-L-A. And under TILA, under the federal guidelines of TILA, the really major component is that lenders must disclose finance charges and what the true annual percentage rate is, okay? All right, so what does TILA stand for? Truth in Lending Act. Remember, consumers treated fairly in the lending market. This is the federal act. If we circle back into chapter, I think 1, we saw that the government plays a big role under the federal level, state level, county, and then city. Different levels of government that play a vital role in our real estate industry. And at the federal level, this is one of them, the Truth in Lending Act. Okay. I think this was imposed by Regulation Z. Congress passed this back in 1968, I think is the year, or 63, or mid 60s. So it's been around for some time. It's implemented by the Federal Reserve, Regulation Z. Remember, we talked about the Federal Reserve and their role playing in the lending business. Okay. So our nation is broken up into 12 federal district banks. We in Florida belong to Atlanta, District 6. So all the banks in Florida can borrow money from the Federal Reserve from Atlanta. Terms called arbitrage. You borrow at a low interest rate, and then they'll take and lend it out at a higher interest rate. So the Federal Reserve does monetary policy, and one of them is they passed this Truth in Lending Act. Okay. So it's to treat all customers fairly in the lending market. Okay, so it requires, under B and C, requires full disclosure of all credit costs, and it also discloses of the true annual percentage rate. TILA, Truth in Lending Act. A couple other terms you may see associated with TILA on the state exam is called the bait and switch. In other words, when lenders advertise one thing and the consumer comes in and they're sold a different thing. Bait and switch. In other words, we're telling you one thing, but we're doing another. Okay. So this is another area of the Truth in Lending Act that the federal government has a good eye on to make sure lenders don't fall into this type of advertising. And also they incorporate a term called trigger terms. Trigger terms is inadequate disclosure, basically. In other words, if a lender is going to use certain numbers in their advertising role, certain numbers, if they use those numbers, they have to have a disclosure of what those numbers mean. Okay, that's called trigger terms. And then the right of rescission under TILA, everybody's had an opportunity maybe one time or another to refinance their home. Right. And so under the Truth in Lending Act, anytime you refinance or get a home equity, second mortgage refinance loans, you get a 3-day right of rescission, which is 3 business days. Okay. So you can rescind the deal within 3 business days. All right. Next question. A developer sold a lot for $36,000. This represents a loss of 10%. What was the cost of the lot? Y'all want to take a minute or so? I'll give you a minute. Get your scratch pad out and your calculator. I'm going to give you 1 minute. Okay. We're talking about a developer sold a lot for 36. That represented a 10% loss. A 10% loss. What was the original value? Okay, let's go ahead and work this out. Here's how this goes. Now watch this. Under number 1, it says calculating a percent loss. Okay, the formula is the value of the property divided by 100 minus whatever that percent loss is. So If a developer sold a lot for $36,000 and that $36,000 represents a 10% loss. So 10% is a loss in the sale. So if I take 100 minus 10%, that means 36,000 represents 90% of an original cost. So if I take 36,000 divided by 0.90, the original cost would have been 40,000. Okay. So that's how much the property really cost. But when it sold for 36,000, that represented only 90% of what it was worth. And that's a 10% loss. Okay. So we're talking about answer D. So a percent loss, you just subtract it from 100 and divide it into the value. And that's going to be the original cost. And if you talk your way through it, when you get the answer, it makes sense. So the original value was 40,000. Okay. So when I sold it for 36, that represents a 10% loss. Now, interesting enough, I can take 36,000 and divide it by 40,000 and I get 90%. Okay. 90%. All right. So you can kind of check yourself. All right. Next question. A buyer decides to purchase a property for $255,000. Which down payment will create the lowest risk for the mortgagee? What do y'all think? Now you have to define something here. This isn't a calculation, okay? This is a theory question with an answer that's a number. You got to understand when we're talking about lowest risk for a mortgagee, who is the mortgagee? Okay, the mortgagee is the lender. Mortgagor is the borrower. So the least risk for the mortgagee would be what? A higher down payment or a lower down payment? Okay. If it's a higher down payment, then it's going to be a less of a loan, which means less risk. Okay. So you want a high down payment. Well, the one that fits here and the highest that can be done is going to be answer D. Okay. Answer D. Remember, this isn't a calculation problem. We're not looking for an actual calculation. We have to understand this in theory. So let's take a look at this. Again, a conventional mortgage, not insured or guaranteed. So this is a non-government loan. We're talking about conventional. Typically, if you look under one definition, is 80-20 is usually the LTV ratio. That's the loan to value. That's the cutoff. Anything higher than that, like 90-10, 95-5, incorporates premium or private mortgage insurance. But 80-20 is a cutoff. Now, what's the down payment? Those are funds that go towards the loan from the buyer. So 20% is pretty much the cutoff for PMI. A high LTV, like a 90-10 or 95, is going to create PMI and a more riskier position for the mortgagee, the lender. They collected less down payment. A low LTV means a large down payment was put. This mitigates a lower risk level for the mortgagee. So under 1D, if that in theory, the more money put down mitigates and lowers the risk, we can see that in this problem, $51,000 being the most money would be your answer. Okay. All right, let's go to the next question. Which statement is false regarding mutual recognition? Now look at this. We go from a math problem, a profit loss or a loss statement, a loss math problem, into an LTV problem theory. Now we're going to talk about mutual recognition, which comes out of what? Florida Statute 475, right? So when we talk about mutual recognition, which statement here is false? Which statement do you think is false? So Florida does not acknowledge reciprocity with other states. They do have a new reciprocity agreement for military, and we'll talk about that when we get to that. But Florida does not acknowledge reciprocity. For example, I'm licensed in Louisiana as well. Okay. Having a license in Louisiana allows me to mail in a package, an application package, to the Mississippi Real Estate Commission, which is our next door neighbor. And without going to school, without taking a test, they issue me a license in Mississippi, because Mississippi and Louisiana have a reciprocity agreement. Florida does not have any reciprocity agreement with any other state. Just because, now watch this, the reason is because Florida, that is the industry, is real estate. If you get into Louisiana, you're talking about agricultural, oil and gas, big, right? You get into Florida, big retirement, big vacation. What does that revolve around? Real estate. I mean, again, you go from Pensacola. In fact, Florida has the most, watch this, has the most beachfront property, linear footage along the state border than any other state in the United States. Okay, usable. Okay, you go up to California, you know, half of their coast is nothing but 500-foot cliffs. You can't use it, right? We're talking about beachfront, right? So Florida has it. And they're lined with condominiums, lined with beach homes, right? So you can see that Florida, being predominantly the industry in Florida, and there's a lot of subcategories, you know, the healthcare industry and other stuff, but the predominant industry for Florida is real estate. And it comes from property management to sales. And I mean, you know, there's nowhere else I've ever seen or heard of that has a CAM position, a community association manager, not a real estate license, but can manage an HOA or a condo association, right? There's a license for that. I've never seen that anywhere else. If you manage anywhere else, HOAs or condos or anything like that, subdivisions, you got to be licensed as a realtor. All right. So Florida has a CAM license, right? So there's a bunch of specialty type things in Florida to deal with real estate because of the industry. And one of the things that they acknowledge, and this will make sense when you understand this, they're so big in the real estate industry. There's so much involved in the 475 law, 61J2 Florida Administrative Code, so much involved with Florida in depth. There's no other state that can compete with it when it comes to education and requirements to know. Okay. So someone that lives in Mississippi, someone that lives in Georgia, they don't come close to all the requirements to know in Florida. Okay. So that's why they don't do a mutual or reciprocity. They just can't apply because they're licensed. But there is a mutual agreement that Florida has with certain states. And those states are the ones that line up the most and are closest to the state of Florida education requirements. Okay. Now, let's look at this. Mutual recognition. And then we're going to circle back and look at the question. Mutual recognition. You have to be a Florida, or excuse me, you have to be a non-resident. Let's start with that statement. You got to live in Florida for 4 months continuously within a 1 year period, or establish a permanent residence. In other words, buy a house, your next day you move in and that's your address, right? You become a resident of Florida. Now, why is that important, John? Because if you're a resident in Florida, you don't get mutual recognition privileges at all or benefits. They're gone. You have to be a non-resident. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're based in Illinois and you're licensed in Illinois, Chicago, okay, Windy City. You're licensed there. They do have a mutual agreement with Florida. Florida has a mutual agreement with Illinois, okay? But if you move and buy your home in Jacksonville and now you live there and now you go, hey, I want to get licensed, but I'm going to go through the mutual recognition instead of sitting through all this 63-hour sales course. I'm just going to do the mutual recognition. They're going to say, nope, you can't do it. It is only for out-of-state residence. So what you should have done is go through mutual recognition, then moved to Florida with your license. Okay. And that's one of the biggest criteria. And if you look at answer B, mutual recognition applicants may be Florida residents or non-residents is a false statement because they're asking which one is false. You cannot be a Florida resident. You can only be a non-resident. Okay. So under B1, mutual recognition, certain states have approved mutual agreements with Florida. You're not going to have to know this for the state exam, okay? But B2, these are the states they recognize: Alabama, Arkansas, Connecticut, Georgia, Illinois, Mississippi, Nebraska, and Rhode Island, okay? And I think the reason they acknowledge all these states is because they're sub-agency states, okay? Louisiana is a designated agency state. Okay, so I think these fall under the agency agreement of sub-agency. That's the law in each of these states, which relatively acknowledges the same thing. That's the same within all these states. Okay, again, you're not going to have to know this for the state exam. What you do need to know is that certain states have certain state has approved mutual agreement with Florida, and their education experience is similar. You want to know number 3. Must be an out-of-state residence, not non-residents, to qualify. And 4, there's a 40-question test, and you got to get 30 right. Remember, no reciprocity. You have to be a non-resident. Watch this on the state exam because they're going to give you the test question. You ready? Joe Smith is licensed in Chicago, the sales associate in Chicago, relocating to Daytona or relocating to Jacksonville, Florida, buys a home in place, currently a Florida resident, and wants to apply for a Florida license. Now, which of the following educations are required? And they'll have mutual recognition in there. And that's not the right answer, okay, because they're now a resident. So they should have got their license when they were in Illinois, or at least before they became a resident. Okay.
Ready to pass the Florida Sales Associate, Broker, Mutual Recognition, or Endorsement State Exam on your first try? Get our exam prep database that contains practice exams tied to over 1,000 exam-style questions with detailed explanations. Enjoy 3 months of 24/7 access from any device, including desktop, laptop, tablet, and mobile. Click here and use the coupon code YouTube to get a special discount.
All right, next question. A shorter loan term results in what? So we're going to circle back, going from mutual recognitions back into finance. What happens if you take a 30-year loan and you shorten it to 15? Does that give you smaller payments? No. Does that give you less principal paid over the life of the loan? No, you're going to pay it off anyway. The principal is going to be paid off anyway. Is that more interest paid over the life of the loan if you shorten it? No. So if you shorten the loan, you're going to pay less interest over the term, which is D. Okay. Answer D is what we're looking at. Now, the term amortized is to pay back. Okay. So principal interest is what your amortized schedule is for the term loan that you're borrowing. Tax, insurance, and PMI is added onto it, but that goes to other things. So the principal interest is your amortized schedule. Okay. Part of it goes to principal. The other part goes to interest. Now, 30 versus 15, the shorter the payback, the less overall interest you're going to pay on the loan. Okay. And again, last payment, you're going to have a zero balance. So here's an example I put up here for y'all. Look at A. Look at example A. This is a 30-year home loan. Now, these are real numbers. This is locally where I live, but I've got an app from a title company that I can type it. And look, to compute closing costs, I use this. I'm plus or minus $1 to $5 off on closing costs. Now, I got our local taxes in, inputted as constant and stuff like that. But these are real numbers for my area. So $300,000 home, 3.5% interest rate, 30-year loan, principal interest, and I got tax and insurance, is $19.91 per month. Total interest paid over 30 years will be $184,965.58. Take that same loan, and I'm going to shorten it to 15 years. I've got a higher principal interest payment. That's going to go up. But look at my total interest, right? It's cut over half by shortening it 15 years, okay? So my cost savings, if you look at the yellow box, my cost saving is about 46.5% by going 15 years. Banks do not like people refinancing their loans to 15. A lot of people have been doing that lately. If they come into a pay raise or they pay off other, you ever hear the snowball effect? You take, the least debt you have and you concentrate and put everything there. Once you get rid of that, you take that number that you were paying monthly and you roll it into the next higher debt. And you get all the way up to where all your personal property, car loans, credit card, all that's paid off. Now you got your home loan. Now you freed up all that debt and you freed up all that monthly allowance expense going to that debt. You can recompute. You may be able to go from $1,900 to $2,600 now. And then you call the bank and say, I want to refinance the loan to 15 years. And look how much money you're going to save in interest overall, right? Good concept to understand. All right, next question. A real estate licensee is interested in obtaining an option on property as the true optionee. Which statement is false regarding a real estate licensee's obligation? Okay. So you have to step back here and understand what is an option contract. So let's go into some explanation first. Let's look at an option. Forget the licensee. Let's look at an option contract. Remember, by definition, it's a unilateral contract. Okay. That is the classification of an option contract. It's unilateral. And here's why. You ready? An optionor. The optionee is the grantee. The optionor is the grantor. So the optionor is the one that's going to grant the title to the optionee if they decide to buy it. So the optionee is the one receiving. Okay. Now, if you look on the left column, the grantee is the optionee and the equitable title is possession. Okay. Equitable title is possession. And then, and when I say possession, they don't have legal title. They get future legal title. They're going to make payments, and they do put a down payment called a premium, and all they do is pay the note and live in the property, okay? The optionor becomes the grantor. If they decide to sell it, they'll transfer the property, the deed, to the grantee's name. The optionor has legal title. They are obligated to sell. The optionee is not obligated to buy, okay? Not obligated to buy. Now, if you look at the gold box, the exercise date is the future date of the optionee to make a decision if they're going to buy the property or walk away from it. It could be 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the road, whatever the agreement is between the parties, okay? The reason it's unilateral is because the optionee has the option to buy. The optionor, which is the grantor, must sell the property if they decide to buy it, okay? So it's unilateral. Obligation is one way. Now, let's take the basics of an option contract here, and let's talk about the licensee involved. Now, everybody look up here real quick. This is and falls under the category of a licensee, right, having an interest in property. So the first thing we need to understand about this principle is disclosure, okay, is disclosure, okay? So if you look under licensee, under number 1, it says licensee is the optionee. In other words, they're purchasing the option contract. They'll put the premium down. They're going to pay the monthly, say for 6 months, and then they'll make the decision. While that's 6 months and they're in the property, okay, they're called the optionee. Remember, equitable title, only possession, okay? And it's kind of a form of seller financing if you want to look at it that way. Now, they have to put a considerable down payment. It cannot be nominal or little. That's what nominal means, just a few. Okay, so it has to be a considerable down payment, right? The licensee needs to disclose that he or she is a licensee, right? I'm licensed. And you also have to disclose that you are not acting as a licensee in the option contract. In other words, there is no relationship that I'm granting to look out for you. In other words, I'm a vested interest in the property as a principal. Although I'm licensed, I'm not playing a role as a licensee. I am an actual optionee. I'm purchasing the property for me. Okay. So 2 disclosures, and the fact they must put a considerable payment down and not just a nominal. And so that's answer A. Okay. So if you circle back to the question, a real estate licensee has an interest obtaining an option on the property as a true optionee. Which statement is false? And answer A, if the option contract, in the option contract, must pledge a nominal. And the answer is no, it's considerable. Okay. If you look at B, the licensee must divest the role or relinquish as a licensee. We talked about that. In other words, they're not going to be in a licensee role. C, the licensee must inform the owner that they're personally interested in acquiring. So there's disclosure. And then the licensee must also inform the licensee not functioning as a real estate agent in the transaction. Okay. You understand the principles of an option contract? The position of a licensee, again, disclosure and considerable down payment is what you're looking for. All right. Which type of risk is the probability that the projected income will not be adequate to meet operating expenses? Always think of an investment opportunity. This comes under the investment section. Let's say you purchase an investment property, okay? And you want to understand the risk. And there's many different types of risk that your book talks about. But this one is the probability that the project itself, the investment property, will not generate. In other words, the income coming from the rent's not going to be adequate to meet my operating expenses. We have a term called operating expense ratio. How much income am I making off the property and what percent goes to expenses? Okay. Anything below 85% is considered good. Okay. So we're talking about a risk probability. Okay. So let's look at this. Assessment of risk. Okay. Again, we're talking about investments. What is risk? How is it defined? The possibility of an investment property will decrease in value or not generate enough income to make it profitable is a factor that an investor must consider in order to continue with the investment. This is pre-planning. Okay. Now, what are risks that are associated with the general business industry or general business category? We got business risk, financial risk, inflation risk, or just a few. Okay. When we talk about business risk, we're not getting the rate of return on the capital. In other words, cash on cash return. Okay. Inadequate income to cover operating expenses of the business. Okay. So we're talking about business risk there, which is the answer. Okay. So you've got an investment and you're not getting the return that you need to pay your expenses. Okay. Financial risk, inadequate income to cover what? Multiple debt services. So what ends up happening on this risk is foreclosure. Now, listen to me on the financial risk part of this. A lot of times investors, especially people beginning in the business, think it's a good thing to have multiple properties. And that's the intent, okay, is to build your portfolio and go to another level, scale to another level. You're adding constantly to your portfolio. But you can get so leveraged out. Remember that term leverage? What does it mean? Borrowing other people's money. If I've got 10 homes, I'm paying 10 loans, right? Well, that's no problem as long as my properties are full. Watch this. But let's say 4 of those properties are located next to a military installation that's getting ready to shut down. Now I've got 4 unoccupied, no rent coming in. Okay. Is that a business risk? You better believe it. It also incorporates the financial risk too as well, because I'm not going to be able to cover the debt service, right? Unless I have enough income producing from the other 6 properties that can cover that debt, okay? And so learning these things kind of early, right, has taught me a lesson that I used to have 2 investment properties. I sold one. And the reason I haven't really went out and leveraged more income is because the property I have right now, if it goes vacant for 6, 12 months, I've got income to pay for each monthly rent. So in other words, I can cover my risk on this property. Now, my intention is to get a return, and I do get a return. It's a really good condo. It's a waterfront condo, and it makes good money, and it stays full. But the whole point of it is, watch this, don't leverage yourself out. Be smart about the investments you're going to make and make sure you got enough money. Hey, what happens if this property goes 3, 6 months without having anybody in it? Can I afford it? So these are all risk things that you want to take into consideration. But the type of risk, the probability that the income is not going to be there to meet expenses is business risk, okay? Inflation risk, you don't want to get caught up in a lease agreement for many years. That's why I do short-term rentals. I did a 3-month agreement with the school teacher, and now she's on month to month, okay? So at any time, if I've got an inflation problem or something like that, then I can give her a heads up. Look, you got a new lease adjusted for price coming in starting next month. Or I'll do an inflation agreement, which means the CPI adjusts 3% a year, which is a consumer price index. That's our inflation index. If it goes up 3% a year, so does your rent. Okay. Depending on what type of rent I got, I don't want to put a risk involved where inflation goes up and I'm still receiving the same money, but I'm paying out more because of inflation. Okay. So kind of review this on the risk area. We're talking about business risk. Don't have enough money. All right. Let's go ahead and proceed on. And we're going to go to the next question. Here we go. A buyer's purchasing a home from the seller for $190,000. The buyer gets a first mortgage loan with a loan-to-value ratio of 60%. The seller takes back a purchase money mortgage for 43% of the balance. How much money does the buyer need for a down payment? All right, let's go ahead and go into this. I'm going to break it down for you. This falls under the category of closing costs required for the buyer. Okay, so we're talking about debits. So some of the debits for the closing costs can be all financial charges from VA funding fees to origination fees on private mortgages or conventional mortgages, origination fees, funding fees. You've got discount points that can be charged. Also, prorations that are paid in advance are going to be a debit to the buyer with, taxes, could be interest, HOAs, dues and all that. So prorations that are paid in advance. Any type of down payment money, again, they're going to have to it'll be a debit to the buyer, have to bring it to the act of sale. Okay. Now let's look at the problem itself. A buyer purchases a home for $190,000. Now the buyer gets a first mortgage loan with an LTV of 60%. Then the seller takes back a purchase money mortgage for 43% of the balance. Okay. How much does the buyer need for down payment? So watch this. You ready? Unpack this like I've always taught you, line by line. Step 1, what's the sale price? $190,000. What's the LTV of that $190,000? 60%, then 40% has to be the down payment. So it's a 60-40 LTV. Step number 2, so the first mortgage is 60% of $190,000. If I take $190,000 times 0.6 or 190,000, and I'm going to work it on my calculator, times 0.6, I get 114,000. Okay. Now that 114,000 is the loan value. Okay. So what I got to determine is what down payment do I need? So if I take 40%, which is my down payment money, 190 times 0.4, I get 76,000. So that's how much down payment I got to bring. I'm borrowing 114,000 and I'm putting down 76,000 on the first mortgage of a home I'm buying from a seller. Now the seller agrees to go, look, John, I'm going to take back a purchase money mortgage. In other words, I'm going to put a lien on the property when I say the house, but I'm going to lend you, watch this, I'm going to take back 43% of the balance. I'm going to do a purchase money mortgage. Okay. So if I take 76% or 76,000 times 43%, I've got 32,680. Okay. That's how much, watch this, they're going to finance. Okay. 32,680. That's what the lien is going to be on, which means you got to do the difference. So then I'm going to take 76, which is my down payment money. I'm going to subtract what they're going to take out on basically a second mortgage or a purchase money mortgage. If I subtract that out, that means I need to bring to closing $43,320. Now watch this. If I bring $43,320, that's going to cover the seller's financing side of 43% of my down payment of 76,000. So that takes care of that, of my down payment. I'm going to borrow 114,000. Okay. So what I got to bring to closing is 43,320. Everybody see that? Okay. Versus if the seller didn't do any financing at all, they'd have to bring 76,000. So basically what the buyer's doing is financing 60% of one loan and 43% of the seller purchase money mortgage. And basically has to bring in the difference as down payment, 43,320. Okay. All right. Next question. How many days notice is required to terminate a month-to-month tenancy at will? Okay. At will. How many days notice is required to terminate a month-to-month tenancy, a month-to-month notice, terminate a month-to-month tenancy at will? Remember, at will means that's not month-to-month, not periodic. It's not an estate for years. This is at will. So, this is, again, it's going month-to-month as far as the payment. But remember, an estate for years, watch this, estate for years, you got to start an end date. So there's not a requirement to give a termination date because it's already on there. But something that's done at will month to month, don't you think the owner of the property wants to know in due time so they can, get ready to market the property and find another tenant before that time frame expires? So there's a minimum notice that must be given to terminate month to month. Okay. And it's going to be 15 days. Okay. 15 days. So we're looking under 2B, tenancy at will, no time agreement, again, month to month. And basically it's 15-day notice. So there has to be a 15. Remember, under B2A, estate for years, there's a beginning and an end date. So there's no need for a termination date. And then we talked about sufferance. That means holdover. It's the least of the tenancies. Okay. Now, we talked about freehold estate. That's the ownership. So that has nothing to do with leaseholds. Okay. So ownership under freehold. Freehold is a free man's holding. Leasehold is a lease holdings. Okay. If you want to sort of say that way. Okay. All right. Next question. Truth in Lending Act is implemented by what? Now, we talked about this, maybe a half a dozen slides ago. We talked about the Truth in Lending Act, or TILA, and we said that it was part of the Federal Reserve, and we talked about who implemented it. Does everybody remember that? Okay, so let's review that again. This is the same kind of slide, but we're going to go back over it again. Truth in Lending Act. Remember, under A, first bullet, Regulation Z, is the Federal Reserve Board that regulates the implementation of the Truth in Lending Act, that implemented. Okay, so Regulation Z is the answer. That is the Federal Reserve Board. Again, requires full disclosure of credit costs and borrowing money, and they have to disclose what the true annual percentage rate is. Everybody familiar with bait and switch and trigger terms. And again, for home equity, second mortgage, and refinance, 3 business days to cancel. All right, which violation is a third-degree felony? Which violation is a third-degree felony? Which violation is a third-degree felony? Third-degree felony. Okay. All right, let's look at civil and criminal penalties. All right. Now, if you want to get a picture of this slide, go ahead, because this is a very important and critical part of your studies, and you will see some questions come off of this. Okay. Third-degree felony is specific on what they're talking here, okay? Now, reproduction or theft of a DBPR real estate license exam is the answer, but there's also one called failure to account or deliver escrow funds, false misleading advertising, provide inaccurate out-of-date rental for compensation. So let's look at those. You want to know these penalties, okay? You may not get all of them, but there's a possibility you may get 1 or 2, okay? And this straight comes out of the Florida law. Second-degree misdemeanor, and I like to use, if you go to the right, you see in parentheses, I like to use the area code memory aid. It's called 256 for second-degree misdemeanor. The 2 stands for second degree. 5 is up to $500 in fines, and 6 is up to 60 days in prison. Okay, that can come under false advertising. So if you see a penalty associated with false advertising, it's a second-degree misdemeanor. Again, 256, up to $500 in fine and 60 days in prison. First-degree misdemeanor is 111. That's the area code. Okay, it's up to $1,000 or 1 year, up to 1 year in prison. 111. First-degree misdemeanor. Remember, second is a lot less than first. Okay, so if you go into pecking order, first degree being the highest of misdemeanors, not felonies, misdemeanors. Okay. And again, this is going to be associated on the state exam with failing to provide accurate and current rental information for a fee. You remember that in our studies. So the civil and criminal penalties that deal in Florida under first-degree misdemeanor, 111, up to $1,000, 1 year in prison. And it has to deal, the answer you're going to see on the state exam, failing to provide accurate and current rental information for a fee. Then you got third-degree felony. This is 355. This is up to $5,000. Again, 3 standing for third-degree felony. $5,000 and 5 years in prison. This is a serious one. And you may see 3 possible examples on the state exam, one being false information on a DBPR application. The other one, and the biggest one we see, is unlicensed activity getting paid a commission. Someone who's serving the public for a commission in sales, rental, whatever it may be, that does not fit into the definition of, watch this, exemptions. Okay, there are some exceptions to not having a license. For example, owning your own property, working for a property manager and getting paid a salary. There's a list of them. But if an individual is selling real estate for a commission and they get a complaint and be found guilty of it, they can be charged with a third-degree felony, and it can cost them up to $5,000 and or up to 5 years in prison. 355. And the last one is theft or reproduction of a DBPR licensing exam. okay, which is the answer to this question. So any of the three under a third-degree felony, you could have as examples of that, okay? Now, licensees under number 4, A4, you got to report to the commission within 30 days if you've been convicted or found guilty of a crime, okay? Misdemeanor or felony, regardless of when the event occurred, okay? So you got 30 days as a licensees. As an applicant, any misdemeanor, any misdemeanor or felony in the past, regardless of what time and where it happened, could have happened out of state of court, has to be filled out correctly on the application, okay? But 30 days, you got to report it. Now, you may see this on the state exam. DBPR reports all criminal matters to the state attorney general of that jurisdiction, okay? So if you think about it, it could be a third-degree felony, could be reported for unlicensed activity, will be handled under the state attorney's jurisdiction, okay? You want to know these penalties, right? Second degree, first degree, and third degree felony. All right, next question. Homeowners are protected from forced sales of their homesteaded property for non-payment of which type of debt? Okay, so you have to understand a little bit about the Homestead Act or what homeowners are protected when it comes to forced sales of their homesteaded property, okay? And again, non-payment of which kind of debt are they open to getting their property? Okay. Let me give you a hint. No mortgage or any type of financing, whether it's seller financing or a lender, none of that falls under this category. The only thing it really is personal property type debt. Okay. Like credit cards, which is the answer. So a vendor's lien, that's owner financing, like a purchase money mortgage. A vendor's lien, special assessment liens, again, that's not going to protect. That's not non-payment of tax or any special assessment. And then a home equity line of credit, again, is another form of a lien that's on the property. That does not fit under the definition of protection of homestead, okay, for non-payment. Only unsecured type debt. And this one is personal credit cards, okay? Let's look at the definition of a homestead. So the Florida law on the property grants certain protection and benefits to the homestead, okay? Again, under 1, residents are protected from creditors for debts owing to personal loans, credit cards, personal loans. It does not protect against foreclosure on default of the debt service, okay? Only unsecured debt. The other thing you may see a question about is the requirements for homestead. So up to 160 acres, you're protected outside the city, up to a half acre if it's inside the city or urban. On personal property, you're protected up to 1,000 of the value. And then, of course, tax exemption, right? We're talking about, again, homestead exemptions. Under tax exemption, remember the county is 25, city's 25,000, county 25,000. School, 25,000. And then above 75,000 of assessed value, the county and city have an additional 25,000. Blind, widow, 500. So you got to know some of the exemptions when it comes to taxes too. But the Florida Homestead or the Homestead Act that protects owners only from unsecured debt. 160 acres, up to 160 acres outside, up to half acre in the city. All right, an appraiser has assigned the following weights to the 3 adjusted sales price. What is the reconciled estimated market value of the subject property? Okay, let me just go ahead and go on right into an explanation here. If you see a problem like this on the state exam, this is nothing more than a reconciliation of values into a final estimate using a percent weight, okay? So an appraiser can use different methods to appraise one property, and they'll assign a weight or the most importance, maybe 45% to the sales comparison approach, which is comparable 1, 35% to the cost approach, 20% to an income approach, okay? What you want to do is in the problem, you just unpack this very easy. 334,500 on a comparable one times 0.45 gives you 150,525. If you look at the black box, and then you come down to line 2 and then line 3 and you multiply those out and then just add them up. And that's your answer. Don't divide by 3. On a weight problem, you don't divide by 3 because 45, 35, and 20% add up to 100, which means the figures you compute add up to 100% of a value. Okay, that's why you don't divide by 3. So anytime you get a percent problem, you calculate the percent, multiply it again, move it 2 places to the left, drop the percent sign, and you'll get a value, and just add them up, and that'll be your answer. All right, next question. A member of the U.S. Armed Forces is transferred to active duty in Jacksonville, Florida. The service member's spouse holds a valid New York real estate license. The service member's spouse desires a Florida real estate license, which is a true statement. Remember, we talked about mutual agreement. Remember that? And reciprocity. Remember we talked about those 2 terms? Here's a perfect example of this. But the only difference is, watch this, you're dealing with the military now. So let me explain. We talk about application requirements for military and spouses. This is what I was talking about under the new reciprocity agreement that Florida institutes for military personnel only. So this is only for U.S. Armed Services members and their spouses. Okay. Remember, mutual exchange, you got to hold an active license and in good standing in another state. There is no course requirement or testing, but you got to complete the application. All application fees are required, and you got to comply with renewal. Okay, renewal requirements and fees. So basically, everybody look up here. Out of state, non-military, regular civilian, you've got to be able to get that 40-question test with 30 right before taking up residency. Non-military. If you're a military and you are in another state and or a spouse of a military active duty member in another state and hold another state license, when you get to Florida, they can apply for a Florida license as residents. Okay. That's under new reciprocity. Okay. That's the only time they do it is with military or spouses. Okay. And again, they fall under the compliance, but all they have to do is apply. Okay. Complete the application only. No school, no Pearson VUE test, no exit exam into the course exam. They just have to apply. But they got to require, all fees apply. And when they go renewal, they have to, meet those needs too. Okay. So let me circle back. Member, U.S. Armed Forces, transferred to active duty in Jacksonville. Service member spouse holds a valid New York real estate license. Service member spouse wants to get a Florida real estate license. Which statement is true? Upon application for a license, DBPR must issue the spouse a Florida real estate license. That's the answer. Okay. Spouse is eligible for mutual recognition. Not in this case because they're military. Spouse must pass the Florida state exam. Nope. Spouse must complete pre-license education. Nope. No education, no test, no mutual agreement. Under new reciprocity, all I got to do is complete application, pay the fees, the required fees, and watch this, the renewal processes they have to follow. Okay. So don't confuse this when it comes to non-military versus military, because you'll have a question in there and they use the same Jacksonville, Florida, but there's no mention of armed forces. Now we're talking mutual recognition. Okay. What type of evidence, unless refuted by evidence to the contrary, will prove a case? What type of evidence, unless refuted by the evidence to the contrary, will prove a case? All right. So we call this prima facie. In other words, prima facie is a term you'll see on the state exam. This is the evidence to the contrary. Whatever else may be, that will prove the case. So this is hard facts. This is known facts. This is not hearsay. This is evidence to the contrary, okay? Called prima facie. In our business of real estate, the real estate license is prima facie. Prima facie of what? It's evident that the holder of a real estate license possesses a current and valid license. For example, if you look at my state license, my broker license, this is prima facie that I'm licensed in the state of Florida as a broker. Okay? My information on the license, first, last name, broker's name and address, license number, expiration date. Okay? So prima facie is evidence to the contrary that proves a case. And in real estate, we use the term prima facie with our licensing and the evidence of a license that show we are current and valid to practice real estate. Okay? You do get a wallet size when you get yours issued. You'll get a nice big one like this one, but you'll get a wallet size, get it laminated, put it in your wallet. I'm going to give you a quick story. I was showing property one day, and I looked in the MLS, and there was no indication that the agent made a remark that there was a security code, and the alarm was set. Okay. And you talk about a deep sinking feeling when you unlock the door and all of a sudden you hear that tone going off, because you only got about 15 seconds, and then you're going to wake up the neighborhood and Ohio's going to hear you. And that's what happened to me. And 15 minutes later, here comes all the law enforcement pulling up, but I've got all my ID, license, I got my NAR membership card. And I just had the client stand outside and explain to him what went on, and everything was okay. So always have some identification on you. You never know who's going to show up, and you want to present that to them, okay? Because, again, if they looked at my driver's license, they're going to see an address on there that doesn't match the address I'm trying to walk into. And I did have clients with me, but there may be times when you're going to do a repair on a house of one of your listings, and you may be the only one. Right? Now that gets a little bit more riskier on the law enforcement side, right? A little bit more fishing. So always have some ID. All right, next question. When a real property owner fails to occupy a property and the land is occupied by someone else for 7 years in the state of Florida, okay, the basis for a title claim may be created by use of what legal principle? What legal principle? Let's look at this. Adverse possession is a term we use in Florida practices, general practices. Adverse possession, the word being adverse, I'm taking it without, it's kind of acquiring legal title involuntarily. The seller doesn't want to give the property to me, but I'm able to get legal title through adverse possession in Florida, 7 years. If the person occupies the property without the owner's consent, can have a legal course and get title to that property. It's 7 years, 7 years in Florida for adverse possession, okay? It's got to be done in a hostile way. Again, that's not a gun or anything, but more or less without the owner's permission. Not concealed. Public's got to be able to see it. Everybody can see you come and go. Taxes are being paid. You make a claim for title. Again, the statutory time frame is 7 years in Florida, adverse possession. Okay? And that property can be transferred. There's a lot of legal involved with it, but if you meet those requirements, you surely can get that property. We better know that, the street term for that is squatters' rights. Everybody's heard that word, squatters' rights. All right. When a loan is paid off in lien theory, such as the state of Florida. Florida is a lien theory state. The lender is required to give the borrower what? Lien theory. Remember, lien theory, the term hypothecation, you own your home. You're giving up the security of your home for them to put a lien on it without giving up possession of it. You're giving them permission to put a lien on your home, but you don't have to give up legal title or possession of it. But when you pay the loan off, what has to be done? And so lien theory, let me give you a hint. There's a mortgage. That ought to be a good hint there. All right. So we're talking about a satisfaction of mortgage. If you look at number 4 on the slide, satisfaction of mortgage, this is a release of the mortgage when it's paid in full. Remember, watch this. Look up here at the camera. Lien theory. You own the property. You have legal title. Okay. They put a lien on it. Okay. So you can't transfer that property until that lien's cleared, right? When the house is sold, the loan will be paid off. A satisfaction of mortgage in lien theory for the mortgage, the lien on the property is going to be a release. It's kind of a letter. It's a release of the mortgage or the lien when paid in full. In other words, now the property can be transferred because the mortgage is satisfied. Lien theory, mortgage, kind of the same type of words, okay? Remember, the promissory note is the financial instrument you sign or your buyer signs. It's the written instrument that shows the debt. It is negotiable, okay? It is, now the note, when it becomes secured, becomes a mortgage or a lien, okay? It's recorded in land records. The mortgagor is the borrower, the mortgagee is the lender, okay? Remember, hypothecation pledges property as security without surrendering ownership. In other words, you give permission to the lender to put a lien on the property in the form of called a mortgage, okay? Voluntary specific lien. That's what it's called, a voluntary. You're allowing the lender to put a lien specific to what? That legal description, okay? And then the satisfaction of the mortgage is a release of that mortgage when it's paid in full. All right, next question. A multifamily residential investment property is appraised at $235,000. The land value is 20% of the total appraised value. Calculate the annual depreciation deduction, round to the nearest dollar. Not looking for a total depreciation value or not even a value of the property. They want to know how much each year, hence the word annual depreciation deduction. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's go back and review a little bit. Okay, what is depreciation? That's the cost needed to maintain an investment. Okay, and that's done on an annual basis. It's called the straight line method. Okay, so what you're doing is you're calculating annual tax depreciation. Remember, land is never calculated in the straight line method. Land will be separate. Always calculate the building only. Now, remember in the last problem we got, they gave us 40 years in the problem as a useful life. Well, if you don't see a useful life, you have to use the IRS code useful life designations. And under number 1, residential is 27 and a half years. And then number 2, commercial, it's 39 years. Okay, that's the useful life that the IRS code gives us. So if you look at the yellow box, and you see in the yellow box, multifamily residential investment appraised at $235,000, land is 20% of the total value. They don't give you an actual useful lifetime. So you have to assume multifamily, that's residential, we're going to use 27 and a half years. Okay. So what I got to do first, step number 1, I got to take 20% of the land value out because I can only depreciate the building. So if I take $235,000 times 20%, that's $47,000 is what the value of the land is. Subtracting it from the total $235,000, the building is worth $188,000. Now what I need to do is take 188, divide that by 27 and a half years. Each year, I can depreciate $6,836.36. The problem says round down to the nearest, so it'd be 68.36. Okay? A couple things you got to know. Residential and commercial, the IRS code gives us those useful times. If you don't see it in the problem, if they don't give it to you, the useful life of the problem, then you need to default to what the IRS code gives us. If they have a useful life in the problem, you want to use that. Okay? Remember, don't depreciate land. You got to separate. Here's the example I was telling you about. You got to pull the land out. Total value $235,000. Land's 20% of that, so it's $47,000. If I take away that from the total value, the building's only worth $188,000. Okay, based on that, over 27 and a half years, I can deduct annual depreciation. Each year, I can deduct $6,836. Okay. Now, what does the IRS say about that? That's what you can deduct off your income revenue of this investment property. What does that do? If it gives you a credit towards your investment return, that means you keep more money in your pocket because that's a credit for you. Okay. Investment only. Investment property only. All right. A buyer paid the state intangible tax $248 on a $155,000 home. What was the mortgage loan amount? And how much was the state documentary tax? Okay. I'm just going to go right into this one. Remember, intangible mortgage tax, that's on the mortgage. That's going to be the loan amount times 0.002. Documentary stamp tax, that's on the promissory note. It's going to be the number of stamps times 35 cents. Okay. So let's figure this out. Buyer paid the state intangible tax $248 on 155. What was the mortgage loan amount? And then how much? So we got to figure out a loan amount and then how much tax, documentary stamp tax was paid. Right? So if the formula is intangible tax 0.002 times the loan amount, then if I want to figure out the loan amount, I'm going to divide the intangible by 0.002. So the tax was $248 divided by 0.002. My loan amount is $124,000. So that's one answer in answer A, $124,000 the loan amount. Once I got the loan amount, I can calculate the amount of stamps I got, and I can calculate how much tax is paid on that on the documentary stamp tax. So if I take $124,000, divide that by 100, I get 1,240 stamps, normal way of calculating it, times 35, I'm going to end up paying $434. Okay. That's my documentary stamp tax. My intangible tax I paid was $248, but they didn't want that. They wanted me to calculate a loan amount to get my documentary stamp tax. So watch this type of problem. Okay. One, you got to reverse it, and then you get that number that gives you your stamp tax. All right. Which statement is true regarding a real estate broker who provides property management services? I'm just going to go into this explanation for time. Anytime we're managing an escrow account when it comes to property management, okay, for brokers, we're not talking about landlord-tenant act, okay? We're not talking about that. We're talking about brokers managing absentee owners' monies. The brokers are allowed to keep up to $5,000 funds for property management, just like we discussed in the earlier slides. Non-bearing interest, it can be interest-bearing. Same slide here. We're just circling back and reviewing. Everybody understands commingling conversion. And here, 5B, the maximum is $5,000 for property management. Okay, so circle back to the question. Which statement is true? Okay, regarding who provides property management service. So the brokers are allowed to keep up to $5,000. Personal funds, okay, it can be personal. That's not commingling. Sales associates are allowed by law to independently provide. No, they can't do it. Brokers required to maintain a separate property management. No, brokers may post a bond. That has nothing to do with that. Okay. So what we're talking about is basics of escrow accounts, $5,000 for property management, $1,000 for sales. If they're going to use one account for both, $5,000. All right, the brokerage relationship disclosure requirements in 475 Florida statutes do not apply to what? So you know that we talk about in the agency disclosure for under the 475 Florida statutes when we're doing an agency agreement. Remember, no brokerage, transaction broker, and we got single agent, right? Single agent, no brokerage, has to be in writing, not signed, but must be in writing. And then transaction is not in writing, and it automatically defaults. If you don't exercise two of those in writing, it is automatic transaction broker. Okay. So those are the three types, and they deal with strictly residential. Okay. So let's go into a little bit about the Disclosure Act. So 475 Florida statute defines residential sales, A, B, and C. Residential improvements up to 4 units. If there's land zoned for up to 4 units. Okay, so land itself, but zoned for up to 4 units. And then property zoned for agriculture of 10 acres or less. So you want to know those three and how 475 defines residential sales. Okay? Because remember, the Brokerage Relationship Disclosure Act doesn't go with commercial or non-residential, only for residential. So you have to understand, they give you an example, you got to see if it fits under the 3 rules or the 3 laws under 475. Up to 4 units, residence, land zoned for up to 4, and then property zoned for agriculture of 10 acres or less. Okay? Now, the next thing is the agency disclosure requirements do not apply. Okay? Non-residential, we talked about that. You don't have to use it for rent or lease either. Business opportunities, unless it's except for 4 or less residential units. Auctions and appraisals. Okay? So the question is, out of these 4, one of them doesn't apply. And the one that doesn't apply here is the one that doesn't fit into the residential definition under 475. Ag property of 10 acres or less, yes, because it's considered residential. An agreement to lease, no. Improved residential property of no more than 4 units, yes. An unimproved site intended for the development of a residential duplex, it's less than 4 units, duplexes 2, yes. So the one that doesn't fit this definition is a lease, okay? So if you know your 3 laws, the 475 laws, on what they define as residential sales, you'll be able to figure it out as you read each answer, okay? All right. A buyer applied a 30-year fixed rate $105,000 mortgage. The lender is going to grant the loan if the buyer will pay an interest at 4.5% plus 3 points, 1% loan origination fee. Total charges, again, debits to the buyer for the loan on the closing disclosure form at the act of sale. Okay. All right. So let's look again. The buyer's lender cost, origination fee, discount points. Okay. So look at the yellow box and you'll see the buyer applied for a 30-year, $105,000 mortgage. The lender will grant the loan if the buyer will pay the interest 4.5% plus, and then 3 points and a 1% origination fee. So those are your financial charges. Remember, everything's on the loan amount. Okay. Fortunately here, they give you $105,000. Okay. So there is no LTV to calculate. So they give you the loan amount. So the origination fee is strictly 1%, 0.01 times the loan amount. That's $1,050. Discount points, remember, for each point, it's 1%. So 1.1%, 2 points, 2%, 3 points, 3%. So it'd be 105 times 0.03 or 3 points, 3150. All you got to do is add them together. So those are going to be the loan charges for this loan. Okay? Very easy. Okay, which tax does not create a superior lien? Okay, so you have to know kind of the definitions, and let's just go ahead and go on into this for time's sake. Remember classifications of liens: general lien, specific lien. General liens go on all properties if you own multiple properties. Specific liens are specific to a legal description, like a mortgage, a vendor's lien, a construction or contractor's lien. Okay, now, when it comes to lien priority, it's broken into superior, junior, and then there's a mechanic's lien. Okay. This is recordation. This is priority because satisfaction of payoff when the property is transferred goes and who's recorded in priority, first, second, third. Okay. So a superior position always takes first priority. Taxes, special assessment, federal estate liens are superior. Okay. Anything junior, like a second mortgage, a HELOC, okay, a general income tax lien, is the date it's recorded, okay? And then the mechanic's lien is not the date it records, but the date it starts, okay? So if we go back and we say which tax does not create a superior lien, we look at federal estate tax, not create, income tax, special tax or specialist tax. Which tax does not create a superior lien. Which one do you think it is? Okay. And income tax. Okay. So the other ones were tax lien, special assessment, and federal estate or estate tax will create a specific lien or a high priority lien or superior lien. Okay. So the income tax income tax falls under the IRS if someone doesn't pay their taxes from wages earned. Okay. All right. The key difference between police power and eminent domain. This falls under the government controls or government's job role or government's duties within the real estate industry. So let's look at this real quick. Remember, government restrictions. I like this memory aid called PEAT, P-E-E-T. That's police power, escheat, eminent domain, and taxation, all of which the government has controls in the real estate industry. Okay. Now, what is the difference? The question is the difference between police power and eminent domain. So if you look at number one, the government does have the right to regulate property. This is zoning, building codes. If you look at three, eminent domain, this is the government's right to take private property for public use, to compensate property owners. Okay. So the big difference between police power and eminent domain is money or compensation. Okay. Eminent domain, the owner is going to be compensated. Police power, there is no compensation. Okay. So the big difference is answer A. Any compensation was paid to an affected owner. Okay. That's the big difference. All right. Any individual or an individual who has earned a 4-year degree or higher in real estate is not exempt from which education requirement? You remember, if you go back into the licensing law 475, licensing law requirements of licensure. Getting a license is what I'm talking about. You've got an exemption of a 4-year degree or higher. Okay. But what they're saying is, if someone has a 4-year degree or higher, they're not exempt from which education below? Which one do you think it would be? Okay, let's review this real quick. This comes straight out of 475 under education exemption. Again, under A, real estate degree or higher, okay, 4-year degree or higher. You are exempt from course, exam, and post-licensing. What you're not exempt for if you hold a degree or higher is biannual continuing education, or every 2 years getting your continuing ed done. All right. Under the normal premise of us going through the course, you got to do 63 hours. You got to take an end of the course exam, and you got to take a Pearson VUE exam. Okay. Once you pass the end of the course, you may want to know this under C2. You got 2 years to take your state exam. So you can hold that end of the course exam to your Pearson VUE for 2 years. Okay. Then it expires. So we're talking about 4-year degree or higher. You are exempt from everything except biannual education, which is every 2 years, even post-licensing. All right. The requirements for a valid deed do not include what? The requirements for a valid deed do not include. You definitely need a witness. You need to deliver and consider. So let's look at this. So let's look at requirements for a valid deed. Okay. Got to be in writing. Got to have the names of the grantor and grantee. Legal capacity, sound mind. Got to have the price for the home. Consideration. Granting clause, addendum clause, legal description. The grantor has to sign acknowledgement. This is, again, with 2 witnesses and notarized. And then there's voluntary delivery and acceptance. So the one that doesn't meet this, you got to have consideration under D, delivery C, and witnessing B. You got to have all 3 of these. It doesn't have to have a seal. Remember, seal is prima facie. Okay, a deed doesn't have to have that to be valid. Now, what I've done for y'all is I put together an actual general warranty deed. Okay, I got this off the internet, and I kind of highlighted everything. So this is a standard general warranty deed or a warranty deed. You can see that the grantee and the grantor on both right and left, that's where they're named. You can see where the consideration is. There's the legal description. There's the habendum clause, to have and to hold, in this case, the same in fee simple forever. Remember the term fee simple absolute or absolute in the very beginning. We saw those two terms meaning the same. The highest and best form of ownership recognized by law. So the habendum clause says to the buyer to have and to hold the same in, meaning the same, meaning the address or the legal description, the same in fee simple, which means the highest and best. And then you got the granting clause. That's the clause that states the intention of the grantor transferring the property, the words of conveyance. And then if you look at the bottom right, the grantor's signature, that's acknowledgement. Notice there's no grantee signature. Watch this. You don't have to have the grantee to sign it to be valid, okay? They only have to be named, just like at the top. So if you want to get a picture of this, go ahead and get it with your camera. I'll leave it up for a couple of seconds. On the bottom left, if you note, the deed instrument is made from the information off the original contract signed. This is where they get the information to make the deed. They pull it. The provisions for the deed is pulled from the actual contract. Not all the information, but what makes a valid deed, they pull it off the contract, that information. Okay?
For more practice questions, videos, and insight into the state exam, we encourage you to join our free exam prep webinar, How to Pass the Real Estate Exam Without Your Real Estate Book and with only 15 to 20 hours of study time. Click here to get registered.